The house next door had sat with its curtains drawn for as long as Nadia Ashgrove could remember, a modest, well-kept structure, identical in age and shape to her own childhood home, separated from it by nothing more than a narrow strip of lawn and a low wooden fence her father, Leonard, mowed and repaired with the same careful attention he gave to his own yard. Nadia had grown up assuming, the way children accept most fixed features of their neighborhood without examining them closely, that the house was simply unoccupied, a rental between tenants perhaps, or a property caught in some slow-moving estate dispute. She had never once, across 36 years, seen anyone go in or out of it except her father, who visited perhaps twice a month, letting himself in through the side door with a key he kept on his own ring, staying for an hour or two, and leaving again without ever inviting anyone to join him. She remembered, as a child, pressing her face against the low wooden fence some summer afternoons, trying to peer past the drawn curtains into whatever the house might be hiding, imagining, the way children do, elaborate and entirely wrong explanations for its permanent stillness, a family who had simply vanished overnight, a house too haunted for anyone to want, a secret her father was somehow guarding on the neighborhood's behalf. She remembered asking him about it exactly once, at perhaps 9 years old, and receiving only a brief, gentle answer that had closed the subject as firmly as any answer she'd ever received from him. That was Grandma and Grandpa's house. I like to keep it looked after. She had accepted this without further curiosity, the way she accepted most things her father told her in that particular, unhurried tone that meant a conversation was finished before it had properly begun. She asked him about it directly, and for the first time with any real persistence, on a Sunday afternoon in early spring, sitting with him on his back porch 3 weeks after a minor cardiac episode had sent him briefly to the hospital and prompted the family to finally, gently, begin discussing his estate in more concrete terms than they ever had before. "Dad," she said, watching him turn his coffee cup slowly on its saucer, "I was going through the property files with the estate lawyer last week, helping you get everything organized the way you asked me to. I found the deed for the house next door. You've owned it for 20 years. There's no mortgage on it, no rental income, no tenant listed anywhere in the records. You've just been paying the taxes and the insurance on an empty house for 2 decades, and I don't think I've ever once heard you explain why." Leonard was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the low wooden fence separating the two properties, and Nadia watched something move across her father's face that she rarely saw from him, a specific, careful vulnerability that made her understand, before he said another word, that whatever answer was coming had been waiting a very long time to finally be spoken aloud. "That was my parents' house," he said finally. "I grew up there. I think it's past time I told you the rest of it properly." Nadia Ashgrove was 36 years old, an elementary school counselor, married to a patient man named Felix, mother to 2 young children who had grown up, as Nadia herself had, simply accepting the empty house next door as an unremarkable fixture of their grandfather's property, a curiosity occasionally remarked upon by visiting friends, never fully explained, absorbed into the family's ordinary landscape the way children absorb most of their parents' unexamined habits. Leonard Ashgrove had lived in his current house for 42 years, having purchased it as a young man of 28, newly married to Nadia's mother, Colette, specifically because of its proximity to the house he had grown up in next door, a choice his own parents, Elias and Agatha, had been delighted by at the time, thrilled to have their only son settle so close that grandchildren, when they eventually arrived, could walk freely between the two homes without ever needing to cross a street. Nadia had known her grandparents well during her own childhood. Elias, a quiet, methodical man who had spent 31 years as a machinist before retiring to a small workshop in the garage, endlessly repairing small appliances for neighbors who brought them by, never once accepting payment beyond a plate of something homemade or a firm handshake. Agatha, warm and exacting in equal measure, known throughout the neighborhood for a rose garden she tended with fierce, specific pride along the side of the house facing Leonard's own yard, and for a habit of pressing baked goods into the hands of any child who wandered near her fence, whether they were her own grandchild or simply a neighborhood friend passing through. Nadia remembered specific Sunday dinners at that house, the whole extended family crowded around a table too small for everyone, Elias telling the same handful of stories every few months, with the same unhurried enjoyment, Agatha fussing over whether everyone had taken enough of everything. She remembered her grandmother's hands, weathered and capable, guiding her own small fingers through a first, clumsy attempt at hemming a skirt, patient in a way that had felt, even to a child, like a particular kind of love that didn't need to announce itself. Elias had died when Nadia was 11, a heart attack that had taken him quickly, without much warning. Agatha had continued living in the house alone for another 6 years afterward, increasingly frail but stubbornly independent, until her own health had finally, gradually, made independent living impossible. She had died when Nadia was 17, in a hospice facility across town, with Leonard at her bedside for most of her final week. Nadia had understood, growing up, that her father held a specific, deep tenderness toward his childhood home and his parents' memory. He spoke of them often, warmly, kept photographs displayed throughout his own house, maintained Agatha's rose garden faithfully despite it standing on property that, as far as Nadia had always assumed, technically belonged to whatever family had eventually purchased the house after her grandmother's death. She had never once considered that her father might, in fact, be the owner of that property himself, quietly maintaining it, entirely alone, for 2 full decades, without a single member of his own family ever fully understanding why. "My mother made me promise something, in her final week," Leonard said, his voice carrying a specific, careful weight. "I don't think I've ever repeated this to anyone, not even your mother, not in the exact words she used. She was lucid most of that week, right up until the final 2 days, and she talked to me for hours at a time, the way people sometimes do when they understand clearly that their remaining conversations are limited and worth spending carefully." He paused, looking toward the fence, toward the drawn curtains of the house beyond it. "She told me she was afraid of what would happen to the house once she was gone. Not sentimentally exactly. She understood perfectly well that she couldn't control the future, and she wasn't asking me to keep it forever, not at first. What she was actually afraid of was a specific kind of erasure. She'd heard from a neighbor that a developer had been buying up several of the older houses on our street, tearing them down, building larger, more modern homes in their place, the kind with none of the character or the history of what had stood there before. She told me very directly, "I don't need the house to last forever, Leonard. I just don't want strangers tearing apart 40 years of our life and turning it into something that erases we were ever here at all. Promise me you won't let that happen, whatever it takes." "So you bought it," Nadia said quietly, "to keep the promise." "The developer was already circling by the time she passed," Leonard said. "I found out, going through her papers after the funeral, that he'd made an offer directly to her, only weeks before she died, and she'd refused it, telling him she wasn't ready to sell. I understood, reading his subsequent letters, that he intended to approach me directly once the estate settled, assuming I'd be eager to simply liquidate the property along with everything else. I made an offer to the estate myself instead, before he had the chance, and I've owned it ever since." "Did Mom know any of it?" Nadia asked. "She knew about the promise," Leonard said. "She knew I bought the house to keep it out of the developer's hands. What she didn't fully understand, I don't think, was how completely I'd end up unable to let go of it afterward. I think in the early years, she assumed I'd eventually rent it out or sell it to a family who'd appreciate the neighborhood the way we did. I think she grew tired of asking, after a while, once it became clear the subject made me retreat rather than actually engage with it. We never really discussed it again, not directly, in all the years before she passed. I think that might be one of the things I regret most, looking back. Letting an entire piece of my grief become a subject too delicate for either of us to bring up honestly." "But why keep it empty?" Nadia asked. "For 20 years. You could have rented it out at least, kept it occupied, kept the promise, and had it actually generate some use instead of just sitting there." Leonard was quiet for a long moment. "I think in the beginning I told myself I would decide what to do with it eventually," he said. "Rent it, maybe, once I'd had time to properly sort through everything inside. But every time I went in to start that sorting, I found myself unable to actually change anything. I'd move one object and then feel compelled to put it back exactly where it had been. I think, somewhere in that first year, the house stopped being a property I owned and started being something closer to a room I was keeping open, in case any part of them was still somehow present in it. I know that isn't rational. I've understood that for a very long time. I just never found a way to actually act differently once the pattern had settled in. Nadia asked, carefully, whether she might see inside. A request she understood, even as she made it, carried real weight, given that her father had apparently not shown the house's interior to a single family member in 20 years. Leonard considered this for a long moment, before nodding slowly, retrieving the key from his own ring, and leading her across the narrow strip of lawn toward the side door he had used, alone, for 2 decades. The interior struck Nadia immediately with a specific, disorienting quality. Not neglected exactly, the way an empty house so often becomes over years of disuse, but preserved with a careful, deliberate attentiveness that felt almost more unsettling than decay might have. The furniture stood exactly where Nadia remembered it from her own childhood visits, undisturbed by dust thanks to Leonard's evident, ongoing maintenance. Photographs still hung on the walls in their original arrangements. In the kitchen, a calendar remained turned to the month of Agatha's death, 20 years frozen in place. In the garage, Elias's workshop sat exactly as he had apparently left it decades earlier. Tools arranged on their pegboard, a small appliance still disassembled on the workbench, mid-repair, as though he had simply stepped away for a moment rather than died, unexpectedly, more than 25 years before. Nadia stood in the doorway of the workshop for a long moment, feeling something in her chest tighten. "You've kept this exactly like this," she said quietly, "this whole time." "I couldn't bring myself to finish the repair, or throw the pieces away, or box them up for donation," Leonard admitted. "I know how that sounds. I've known for years how that sounds. I think some part of me believed, without ever fully articulating it, that finishing what he'd started, or clearing it away entirely, would be its own kind of second loss, as though the unfinished repair was somehow still connected to him, still active, as long as nobody completed or discarded it." They moved through the rest of the house slowly, Leonard narrating small, specific memories attached to almost every room. His mother's sewing basket, still open on a chair in the front room, a half-finished mending project still tucked inside it. His childhood bedroom, repurposed decades earlier into a guest room for visiting relatives, still holding a small shelf of his own boyhood books that Agatha had apparently never once considered removing. In the dining room, the table remained set with a lace runner Nadia recognized from every holiday of her childhood, though no plates had been laid across it in 20 years. A hutch in the corner still held her grandmother's good china, dusted regularly but never once used, waiting, it seemed, for occasions that had simply stopped arriving. In the hallway, a series of framed school photographs traced Leonard's own childhood year by year, stopping abruptly at his high school graduation, the wall space beyond it left conspicuously, permanently bare, as though Agatha had always intended to continue the display and simply never gotten around to it before her own decline began. "I used to think, walking past that empty space on the wall, that I should fill it in," Leonard admitted, noticing where Nadia's attention had settled. "Add photographs of you, of your own children. I never did. I think, somewhere along the way, I decided that continuing the wall myself would mean claiming the house as an active, ongoing part of my life, rather than simply a room I was keeping preserved. I couldn't quite let myself do that for a very long time. I don't think I understood until just now how much you've actually been carrying," Nadia said, standing with her father in the quiet, preserved stillness of his mother's front room. "Not just the cost of maintaining a whole second property for 20 years, the weight of walking through this, twice a month, for 2 decades, keeping it exactly frozen at the worst week of your life." "I think I needed it frozen for a long time," Leonard said. "I think in the early years, walking through it exactly as they'd left it felt like the only way I still had access to them at all. I'm not sure I need that anymore, quite as completely. I think I might have simply never found a good enough reason to change anything once the habit had settled in this deeply." Nadia raised the subject again several weeks later, sitting with her father and Felix at her own kitchen table, the three of them working through what she understood to be a genuinely difficult, layered question, not simply what to do with an empty property, but how to honor a 20-year-old promise without allowing that promise to remain indefinitely, a kind of quiet, unexamined grief neither fully processed nor fully released. "I don't think Grandma actually asked you to freeze the house in time forever," Nadia said carefully. "I think she asked you to protect it from being erased, from strangers tearing it apart and building something with no memory of who you all were. I don't think that's the same thing as never letting anyone actually live in it again." Leonard considered this. "What would you suggest instead?" "I think you could let it become something that's still alive," Nadia said. "Not sold to strangers, not torn down, but not sealed shut either. Felix and I have been talking, actually, about whether we might use it ourselves, not to erase anything, but to actually bring some of its life back. The kids could grow up walking between the two houses, the way you did with your own parents. We could keep the rose garden going properly instead of just maintaining it from a distance. I think that might honor what Grandma was actually afraid of far better than keeping it perfectly sealed and empty ever could." Leonard sat with this for a long moment, looking out toward the fence separating the two properties, the same fence he had mowed and repaired faithfully for over 4 decades. "I think I've been afraid," he admitted finally, "that letting anyone actually live in it again would mean admitting the house didn't need to stay exactly as they left it in order for me to still hold on to them properly. I think I've been treating the preservation as the whole of the promise, instead of understanding that the promise was really about protecting the meaning of the place, not the literal, unchanged arrangement of every object inside it." "I think you kept the promise completely," Nadia said gently. "For 20 years, at real cost to yourself, you made sure that house never became something it wasn't. I don't think letting your own family finally live inside it undoes any of that. I think it might actually be the truest way to finish keeping it." Nadia and Felix moved into the house the following autumn, working carefully alongside Leonard to decide, room by room, what could remain exactly as it had always been and what could gently, respectfully, begin accommodating an actual, ongoing life again. They kept Agatha's rose garden, now tended by 3 generations rather than 1. They kept Elias's workshop largely intact, though Leonard finally, after 26 years, completed the small appliance repair that had sat unfinished on the workbench since his father's death, working through it slowly one weekend with his own grandchildren watching, narrating each step the way he remembered his father once narrating similar repairs to him. The sewing basket remained in the front room, its half-finished mending project preserved exactly as Agatha had left it, though Nadia's own daughter, 8 years old and newly interested in needlework, had begun, with her great-grandmother's old supplies, small projects of her own beside it. Leonard continued visiting nearly as often as he always had, though the visits carried a different quality now. No longer the solitary, careful maintenance of a sealed memory, but ordinary family time, shared meals, grandchildren's noise-filling rooms that had stood silent and preserved for 2 full decades. He finally, with Nadia's gentle encouragement, continued the photograph wall in the hallway, adding images of Nadia's own wedding, of his grandchildren's early years, the display running unbroken now from his own boyhood, all the way to the present, no longer stopping abruptly at a wall space that had waited empty for over 2 decades. He also, on a quiet afternoon that spring, finally set the dining table with Agatha's good china, inviting the whole family for a meal in the room that had sat formally arranged but entirely unused since her death. She would have hated to see this china just sitting behind glass for 20 years, he told Nadia, setting out the plates with the same careful attention his mother had once brought to the same task. "I think I understand now that keeping it safe and keeping it alive were never actually the same goal, even though I spent 2 decades treating them as though they were. I think this is what she actually wanted," Leonard told Nadia. One evening the following spring, the two of them sitting together in the same front room where he had once walked her through his mother's untouched sewing basket. Not a museum, just proof that we were here, and that being here mattered enough to keep going, in some form, rather than simply being erased. "I think I mistook stillness for preservation, for a very long time. I don't think I understand it that way anymore." Nadia told her own children the fuller story that same week, sitting with them at Agatha's now active dining table, explaining, in language suited to their ages, exactly why the house next door had stood silent for so much of their grandfather's life, and why it mattered so much that they were now the ones filling it with noise again. Great-grandma asked Grandpa to protect this house so strangers couldn't tear it apart and make everyone forget she and Great-grandpa were ever here, Nadia told her daughter, who had taken to spending most afternoons at Agatha's old sewing basket, working through her own small projects beside it. For a long time, he thought protecting it meant keeping everything exactly the same, never letting anyone actually live in it again. It took him a while to understand that the best way to keep his promise was actually to let all of us keep living here too, so the house stays part of a real, ongoing family instead of just a memory nobody's allowed to touch. Her daughter considered this with the specific seriousness children sometimes bring to family history, considerably heavier than their ordinary daily concerns. "So the house isn't sad anymore?" she asked. "I don't think it ever fully stopped being a little sad," Nadia said honestly. "I think some houses carry both things at once, the sadness of everyone who's gone and the happiness of everyone who's still here. I think that's all right. I think Great-grandma would probably be glad to know both things are true here now, instead of just the sadness sitting here all alone for 20 years. On the 21st anniversary of Agatha's death, the family gathered for dinner in the house Leonard had once kept sealed and silent for 2 full decades, his grandchildren's noise filling the same rooms that had stood frozen for so long, the rose garden blooming along the side yard under 3 generations of careful attention, the small appliance on the workbench finally, after all those years, fully repaired and quietly humming back to life in the corner of the kitchen where Agatha had once kept it. Nadia stood in the doorway for a moment before joining the rest of the family at the table, watching her father help her son with a small woodworking project at Elias's old workbench, the same patient, careful attention passing quietly down through a 3rd generation now. She thought about the specific, humbling weight her father had carried for 20 years, a promise kept so completely and at such real personal cost that it had nearly calcified into its own kind of permanent grief before anyone in the family had understood what was actually happening next door. She thought too about how close that promise had come to remaining sealed forever, preserved perfectly and entirely alone, had a single hospital scare not finally prompted the conversation that unlocked it. Some promises, she understood now, are kept so faithfully that the person keeping them forgets there might be a difference between protecting something and simply freezing it in place. And some houses, once finally allowed to breathe again, prove that the truest way to honor what came before isn't to leave every object exactly where grief first set it down, but to let life keep happening inside the same walls, gently, generation after generation, exactly the way the people who first built a home there would probably have wanted all along.